Alrighty, so we're about 3 after, so I think it's a good time to get started. I see plenty of people already in the attendees room with more and more filing in. So yeah, let's get things kicked off here. First off, thanks a ton for everyone for taking time out of their days to come hang with us here. I'm super excited about the content we're about to go into, secrets management. This is the second of our webinar series. As you'll see, we're going to be doing these bi-weekly webinars regularly to talk about data engineering concepts through Apache Airflow. This time with me, I have Faisal from our field team. Faisal, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm an enterprise architect at Astronomer. I've also contributed to the alternative secrets backend code and the open source Airflow. So yeah, so I'm really excited to be talking about this and sharing this information with you guys.
Awesome. So let's dive right in. For everyone attending, please feel free to drop questions in the chat, and we'll get to them as we go along here. And we'll reserve some time at the end for questions as well. So with that, Faisal, over to you.
Yeah. Okay, so like we talked, so as you guys know, the webinar topic is Secrets Management with Airflow 2.0. To briefly talk about Airflow and recap what most of you guys probably already know, but Airflow is a top-level Apache Software Foundation project. It's used by over 1 million data engineers and deployed by over thousands of companies. It's a very vibrant open source community. And with Airflow 2.0, there's a lot of changes coming out, and some of that has to do with secrets management, so we're excited to share that with you guys. To go straight into it, what are Airflow secrets? So Airflow secrets are pretty much sensitive information that are used as part of your DAGs. There's 3 types of secrets for Airflow. The first one is variables, and they're just a generic way to store and retrieve arbitrary content. And they're like a key value store within Airflow. So you just have a key, and that would be the name of your variable, and then a value that variable would actually have. Then you have connections, which are usually used to connect to external systems. And they have to be formatted in a very specific way, a URL encoded URI. And then you have configurations. So you can actually store Airflow configurations within your secrets backends. And this is actually something that was personally new to me, and I didn't know until I actually started contributing to the alternative secrets backend code. So I want to share a little bit more about that. Because it has a lot of potential in terms of the power it provides to keep sensitive configuration information secure. These are just some examples of what a secret a configuration value would look like in your secrets backend. So, like your frenet key could be stored there, passwords, SMT passwords. So if you're using email, so any sensitive information within your configuration, you can use as an Airflow secret potentially. But the main thing is, when we're talking about secrets management, where do we store these secrets? How do we manage them? How do we think about them? And that's really what I want to dive into today. So the first one is, in terms of storage, is environment variables. The go-to place where you initially think about getting set up on Airflow, the easiest way to get set up is using an environment variable, because they're simple and easy to use, but they come with some caveats, right? They can be difficult to maintain. Why? Because there's no inherent encryption built in. You have to build in the management of those environment variables. You can't access them from the UI or the Airflow CLI. So there are those caveats that come with using environment variables, but they also have some power. Using them for Kubernetes secrets can provide some security. And if your Airflow deployments are, if your variables are very tied into your Airflow deployments and you're deploying on Kubernetes, those secrets can be very powerful, as they're very difficult to change. They're kind of like hard-coded, you could say. And then they live and die with your Airflow deployment or its configuration. So depending on how you've configured and deployed Airflow, your environment variables will live within that realm. And here's just an example of what your Airflow environment variable would look like for your secrets. It's a really simple environment variable. You have Airflow_var and then your variable name. And the same thing for a connection, Airflow_connection, and then your connection ID. It's very easy to understand and implement.
Hey, Faisal, when have you seen the environment variables method used? Do you see it a lot of times people are starting off for prod environments or dev environments? When would you recommend somebody do this?
Yeah, so I would say if you're using in a production environment, you would use them for things that are kind of specific to that environment, right? That you're not going to want to change, and they're tied within that production environment in itself. Otherwise, if you're going to need to change your variables based off of, maybe some development patterns you have, then you're not going to want to use environment variables in that scenario. And if you're in a development setting, again, it's kind of on your patterns, but I think probably the UI or alternative secrets backend would be more flexible, especially in a development environment, because of the ease of access to those.
Gotcha.
And I'll talk about those next, right? So the Airflow or Metastore database, this provides a lot of flexibility and interactability that with your variables and your connections, so with your secrets. They can be accessed from the Airflow UI, the CLI, or the API. So you kind of see everything through your Airflow environment. It's all in front of you, and you can interact with it in multiple ways. Adding connections to these doesn't require to URL encode or UI format them. So any other secret backend, you're going to have to do that formatting. But with the UI or the Metastore database, sorry, you don't have to do that. They're automatically encrypted for you, and they live beyond your Airflow deployment. They actually live with your Airflow Metastore database. So whatever you've configured your Airflow Metastore database to have in terms of resiliency or disaster recovery, and however you've deployed them, if it's in Kubernetes with persistent volumes, they'll survive that according to how you've configured that. And then they can also be exported, imported really easily. The UI has actions that you can export. You can use the command line to do that. You can use the API to do that. So there's a lot of flexibility there. So you can programmatically access these pretty simply. And then one of the caveats to the Airflow Metastore database, though, is that it probably won't be approved by many security teams in a production environment. And this is what I've seen from my personal experience, is usually they have a solution for sensitive information already in place. They're going to want you to connect to that. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But as an example of the API with the new stable API for Airflow 2.0, this kind of becomes really powerful. Is here in this example, I'm just adding a variable called from API, and its value is true. And you can see in my example here, that'll show up in your UI, and you can see them right away. And then even if you want to export connections, you can use the command line tool, and you can export them in different formats, right? You can export variables secrets in a YAML, and an environment file, and a JSON file, or even to your standard output. So there's a lot of robustness that you can play with the Airflow Metastore database. So next.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
I sneezed.
Yeah. So the next thing I want to talk about with that flexibility is alternative secrets backends, and this kind of plays with Airflow's core principles, right? So Airflow is designed to orchestrate and connect to everything needed for your pipelines. So why shouldn't you think about your secrets in that way? So, why should your secrets be different to Airflow? And with the alternative secrets backends, there's quite a few built-in ones with HashiCorp Vault, GCP Secrets Manager, AWS Secrets Manager, Azure Key Vault, even AWS Parameter Store. So there's a lot of options you have there, especially for cloud resources. But let's say you even have your own secrets backend that's very unique to your company or organization. You can write your own hooks and operators and provide that as an alternative secrets backend. So you can even make those yourself potentially. And if it's something that other people are using, you can open source it as well, which would be awesome. But what they really provide are secure storage and access for your sensitive secrets, right? These are tools that were made to provide protection, redundancy, auditing, all those important things for sensitive information. So why not use those tools for that? They live beyond your Airflow deployments. So whatever your protections and your recovery and your resiliency are for these secrets backends, that's where they'll live, and they'll survive through those configurations. They can be managed, rotated, and version audited easily. So this is something security teams will really like. If they want to pull a secret, they can do that. They don't have to go to your infra environment. If they need to rotate keys or service accounts, they can do that. If something breaks, you can always go back a version with most of these secrets backends. Of course, very importantly, they can be audited. So you can know what's happening, who's accessing them, when they're accessing them. So you have all of that functionality built in with these that you would have to build on top of if you use some other option. And then with Airflow 2.0, you have the flexibility to choose what combination of secret types you want to use with your backend. And an example of that, which I'll show in a bit, is really you can use Vault, for example, as a connections backend, and you can use the Airflow Metastore database as for your variables, right? So you can use a lot of different combinations. And while you could have done that before with version 1, What 2.0 does is if you can set a configuration where you don't actually, you tell Airflow not to look at Vault or any other secrets backend for something. So I can say, hey, look at Vault for connections, but don't go there for variables because you're not going to find it. And we'll show you some code of how that works in a bit.
So in your, Faisal, in your experience, do you see people using those backend connection stores as the production, the go-to way to get secrets in production environments?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is probably the go-to way to do that, especially when you're working with connection information that's on-prem, right? So if you're in a hybrid environment, this is definitely the best way to go. But as well as even if you're not in a hybrid environment and you're purely in the cloud, then this is a very viable option. Yeah. So now that we kind of know all of your secrets backends, there's an order of operations to Airflow. So Airflow looks for your secrets in a very specific order, and you can't configure or change that. So the first place it's going to look is your alternative secrets backend. So like we talked about Vault or Google Secrets Manager. And then if it doesn't find it there, it'll go to environment variables. If it won't find it there, it'll look in your Metastore database. So this kind of allows you to provide some sort of resiliency in a way. So you can really manipulate this just to really play with your secrets. You can even override secrets temporarily or in a given scenario by playing with these order of operations. It really, so in a development environment, this can be really, really interesting to play with. So I kind of talked about all the backends, but what I want to talk about next is a way to use secrets without actually having to physically manage them. And that's with GCP Workload Identity and AWS IAM Roles. And the concept here is that you're integrating Airflow with these IAM roles, and you're not having to actually touch the secrets. It's really implicitly allowing Airflow to connect to these systems without managing the actual connection or service account information. And what that does is it basically, because you don't need to touch it, it's more secure. It's flexible because it ties your cloud service account with your Kubernetes service account. And then they're easier to manage because once you set it up, all you're doing is managing permissions from that point on. And what I want to show in this architectural example is I've used Google as my example, but just keep in mind that AWS pretty much works the same way from a high-level architecture. The way they implement it of the covers may be a little bit different, but in terms of your interaction and the flow, it'll be exactly the same. And what's happening here is with workload identity in this example, your cloud service account is bound to a Kubernetes service account, most likely your scheduler and your worker. And by that, they pretty much inherit the permissions of your cloud service account. So here I have a cloud, so that service account may have permissions on cloud storage, BigQuery, or any other cloud resource, and even on Secret Manager. So then what I can do is I can say, hey, access any of these cloud resources using this cloud service account, and I don't have to configure all of the separate connection IDs for those. So it makes secrets management really simple, and it's like a single point of entry for that. So now you're not worried about 10, 15, or however many connections you may have in your Airflow environment.
So this seems like something that would be a security team's dream, right? Where they can just centrally manage everything without having to have any plain text credentials.
Yeah, absolutely. This is probably the way of the future. It's the way to go. And they don't have to worry about who has access to that, right? Because only they will set that up for you in your deployment potentially. So it's awesome that way. So now that we've kind of talked about, all the secrets and even some alternatives to that, what I wanted to present were like where should you keep your secrets given certain scenarios, and take these as guidelines, right? Just they're more of a mindset and how to think about this more than anything else, right? If you can use cloud, if you're using cloud resources and you can use workload identity or AWS IAM roles, then use them when possible, right? They really simplify the management of everything. And the next step is if you have to store connection or sensitive information, then use an alternative secrets backend. Just because they're more secure, your security teams are probably going to appreciate that a lot more. But when it comes to variables, and here I mean generic variables, it really depends on your development and security patterns. Ideally, you'll want to use a alternative secrets backend whenever possible, and that's really playing on the fact that you probably don't want to store things in many different places. So just simplify that in terms of management, but you may not like that. You may want your developers to use variables from the Metastore database just because it's easier for them. So if you have that pattern, then you can use the Metastore database, and allow you to see and access and manage them directly. And you can even create the fall through, right? If you look at the order of operations, you can use alternative secrets backend in combination with the Metastore database. And I didn't call out environment variables here, but you can if you're using it, for example, in Kubernetes, or it's very specific to your Airflow deployment. Then yeah, you can use some variables there as well, or connection information. The other tricky part about Airflow is local development with secrets, right? Because we have a lot of our secrets, they're usually in a cloud resource, or they're in Vault, or they're somewhere else. So how do we bring those secrets in for local development? What I would say is that there's no great pattern, but there's some really good patterns if your situation allows it. And so I've kind of classified these as better, and if you must, but not as safe, and I'll explain that a little bit. But better is if you're using something like Vault or any other alternative secrets backend, and you have a user account that has the same access that maybe your Airflow development environment does, then you can just kind of configure your Vault or your local Airflow to point to Vault with your user token to the same connections paths, and it's pretty much the same environment as your Airflow deployment that you would have somewhere else for local development. And then if you're using workload identity, or if you're using cloud resources and you have a user account that also has access to those resources, then you can use your user account as a service account. That really simplifies it. You're not worried about having multiple different keys or service accounts and having to maintain them locally separate from your development environment. And then the next that is if you must, but not as safe. And really that's environment variables. And environment variables aren't inherently unsafe. It's just that now the management and the security and potentially the encryption of that is left up to you. So you're going to have to figure all that out. So that's why I say if you must, but not as safe. And then Airflow also allows you to use a local file as a secrets backend. I probably would personally only recommend this for local development. You can do that. So you can have a local file where Airflow writes to and reads from for local development if you need to.
I'm already seeing the security teams, their hairs raising at that one if everything's just sitting in a file on developers' laptops.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a good way to get started really quickly, especially when you're like figuring out how Airflow works. But when once you get really into it, then you're going to want to use the better options. So now that I kind of covered all of that, here's some general best practices, and take these again as guidelines and as a mindset when you're thinking about secrets management and Airflow in general, right? Separation of concerns. Use Airflow for what it does best, right? So integrate it with systems that are better for other things. So Airflow is an orchestrating and pipelining and scheduling tool. Use it for that, and then connect it to other things. So you don't want to use Airflow for your data processing. Similarly, you probably don't want to use Airflow for the management of your secrets in production settings. Again, the mindset of don't pass sensitive information around when possible. So this really plays in the workload identity or IAM roles. And then have a strategy for how to manage your secrets and controlling access. So if you think about your Airflow deployments ahead of time, and you plan out what type of resources it needs access to, where those resources are. They on-prem? Are they all in the cloud? How are people going to want to be interacting with them? If you think about that all ahead of time, then you can kind of implement the next step, which is using the right combination of secrets backends. So, and if you can figure out, is it a hybrid approach you want with secrets management, or is it, just you can purely use workload identity, or you need to use Vault? All that will kind of be clear once you have that strategy. And again, that key recommendation is sensitive information should be an alternative backend or integrate with IAM roles. Next, I want to get into examples. So let me share some examples with you guys and show you guys how all this works.
Just a quick note that all of the code that Faisal walks through will be distributed afterwards so that you can refer to it for whatever workloads you're trying to write.
Pull that up.
There's some good questions in the chat. We're going to get to them right after we walk through this example code so that we can make sure that you give them a full answer.
Let me just pull this up. Okay. So what I want to share here is a DAG that implements this secret, and I'll also show how this is configured. But what this DAG is pretty much intended to do is it has a variables task which pulls a variable from one of our secrets backends. It has a connection task that'll pull from Vault, so it'll pull connection information from Vault. And it has a BigQuery load task using workload identity. And let me get into some of those tasks. So here's the code for that. And what I've done here is I've actually broken Kenton's cardinal rule of best practices by having top-level code at the top of my DAG. So I apologize, Kenton, for that. But you know, basically what this is two functions that one gets a connection and the other will get a variable. And it'll just print the connection information, and it'll print the variable name and the variable value. So all I'm doing here is the first task, the connection task. We'll call that get connection function, and I'm going to pass it a connection ID called SMTP default. And then my next task, the variable task, will call a variable that I've called hello, and I'll show you where that sits and print out that information. And then my BigQuery load task actually pulls my bucket name and my BigQuery table name from a variable. And it also, if you notice, I don't provide it any connection information. Why? Because it's going to use workload identity, so I don't actually need to give it any connection service account or any connection key or anything related to that. So all that's on the back end for it. So for the variables, a few things I wanted to show before I show you the execution of the code is when you look at the UI, and this is where I've stored these variables, is I have a variable called hello world that's going to try to access. This is the one from the API, but you can also mask some of your variables. So if your variables are sensitive in the Metastore database, if you use certain keywords, you can mask them. So password is one of those keywords. Secret is one of those keywords. So if you notice, for example purposes, I've masked my bucket in BigQuery table. There's other keywords like API key, authorization, and there's probably a few others that I'm missing. But you can use those keywords to mask them if they're particularly sensitive. But what I also want to show is that I've actually created a variable called hello in my environment variables. And this has the same value as world, except it has an exclamation mark. The reason I did this is I want to show you guys the order of operations. Because the order of operations is alternative secrets backends, environment variables, and then Metastore database, it should actually pick up this variable with value with exclamation mark, and not the one in the Metastore database that doesn't have the exclamation mark. And I'll show you that in the logs. And we can validate that that works. And then I just want to show you connections. I have no connections in the Metastore database, nor in my variables, as you noticed. So you won't see anything here. Rather, I'm pulling it from Vault. So I thought I'd show you guys Vault and how that looks. So Vault, really, you set it a connection path. And here I have it as Airflow connections. And if you notice, actually, let me go back one sec. If you actually notice, I don't have one for variables because I've told Airflow not to look at Vault for variables. So all I need is the connections. And here you can see I have a SMTP default and a Google Cloud default. And I'll explain these. So the SMTP default, what it should look like is, or any connection rather, what they should look like is you have your connection, base connection path that you'll provide Airflow, and then any connection ID name should be the end of that path. Right? So this will kind of be your connection name. And then the key will be connection_URI. And the value will be your uncoded URI. Right? So all of your connection informations have to follow this pattern. And what I've done for workload identity to work is workload identity, or your operator for GCS typically will look for a default connection if you don't provide it. So I've just kind of created that connection name just so it finds it and it doesn't error out, but I've actually not provided it anything, right? It's just the connection type, but I've not actually provided it any other information that it would need if I was just using it as a plain service account. And this follows the same pattern, right? Connection ID name, connection_URI, and then the connection type with an empty information. Right? So that's how that's set up. And what I want to show is the code, so the execution. Right? So this is the logs for the variable task. If you notice, I had a print statement that did hello world, and it's printing the one with the exclamation mark. So that actually pulled it from my environment variable and not from my Metastore database. So just keep that in mind. For the secrets, for the connection information, sorry, that pulled from Vault, as you notice, because it pulls that whole URI and kind of parses it and pulls out the different pieces of it. And that's what my function was doing. So it's printed out here. And we had nothing in the Metastore database, and we didn't have anything in the environment variable. So it's directly pulling from Vault. And then for the BigQuery load task, you can see that it was successful. I didn't provide it connection information. I didn't provide it anything else. I didn't even provide it a path. It just used workload identity on the back end to pull that information. So what I want to show next is also how those secrets actually look, or so that configuration actually looks. Let me pull that up here. Right. So here is the Airflow configuration that you would set. So you would set two Airflow configuration if you want to use an alternative secrets backend. In this case, I'm using Vault. So you have the Airflow secrets backend configuration, and you just provided that operator, that path for that. And then in terms of configuring that connection, I have to provide a connections path. And here, as you guys noticed in Vault, I had Airflow/connections. That was my base path for it to look for connections. And then what I also want to show is here for variables, I set these as null. And this is something that came out in Airflow 2.0. I'm not sure if they're backported, but I do know they're available in Airflow 2.0. Is that so when you provide it null for your variables path or for your config path, what you're telling Airflow to do is, so you're saying, hey, whenever you see a variable, don't worry about querying Vault. Don't go to Vault, don't hit its API. And so that kind of allows Vault to be a little bit more resilient. I know from past experience that at a previous company, we were using Vault just for connections in the Metastore database for variables. But every time I'd parse the DAG or anytime we wanted variables, I'd keep hitting Vault. And we had a very small deployment of Vault, and it wasn't scaled that high yet. So we would actually lose connection requests on Vault, just because we're hitting it so much. We had thousands of DAGs doing that. So this is a good way to avoid that if you're using that hybrid approach. And then just for requirements, right? If you're using workload identity, you're going to need the Google provider package. But if you're using GCP Secrets Manager, you would also need that. And then for the Vault to work as your alternative secrets backend, you would need Apache provider or Airflow provider for HashiCorp. But yeah. So that should cover it in terms of secrets. What I also want to share with you guys is some promo that we're doing. Let me pull that up. But what we want to do is actually give you guys a promotion for the Airflow certification that we're doing. So we're kind of excited about that, and I want to share that promo code with you guys in a sec.
So as of today, Astronomer launched our Airflow certification course. If you navigate to our website, you'll find the banner for it. And if you enter this promo code, you'll get 100% off the course. So please sign up and let us know what you think. Good for one day only. Awesome. Awesome. That was all of the slides and code that we had to go through today. We can take some questions now. So I see a couple of questions in the questions section. There's also some in the chat. So Faisal, I'm just going to feed them to you, and you can answer them as you best see fit.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So first off, I think this is coming from a user on Astronomer. Can we use different external secrets backends for different workspaces on Astronomer?
Yeah, you can, right? So your alternative secrets backend, so what you can do is for Astronomer, you can set them in your Docker file. You can set those alternative backends like I had shown. So for the environment variables, you would just set those parameters for your Airflow configs, and you can do that there. That's probably one of the ways to do it. But yeah, you can have them for different Airflow deployments.
Awesome. Another question is, what is the configuration for hybrid, for example, for Vault secrets and Airflow metadata DB for variables? Can you talk through that once more, Faisal? I think your code showed it, but I think explaining it once more would be really helpful.
Sorry, so you broke up a little bit. I didn't get the core of the question.
Sorry about that. So talk about how you can use a hybrid approach between one section for variables, something else for connections. You talked about it, but just run through that once more.
Yeah, so with the hybrid approach, what you can do is, for example, you can configure a Vault or a secret or any secret manager, to be honest, to look at a specific location for connections only. And then using the order of operations, you can actually have your variables, for example, in the Metastore database. So because Airflow looks for all secrets in that order of operations, it'll hit your alternate secrets backend first. It won't find it there. And then it'll look in environment variables. If you don't have anything there, it won't find it there. And then it'll look in the Metastore database and it'll automatically find it there. So you can kind of use that hybrid approach. If you're using Vault, if you don't want to use Vault for variables at all, or an alternate secrets backend for at all, then you can set that parameter to null, and then it won't even look there. It'll go to environment variables first, and then to your Metastore database. So I hope that clears it up.
So when you send out the example code afterwards, will that include an example on how exactly you configure that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Cool. Another question is there any sort of way to use two secret backends for a single deployment? Like, let's say I wanted to use Vault for my connections and AWS SSM for my variables. Is that something Airflow supports today, or is that something where it's designed only to use one as of right now?
Yeah, so in terms of alternative secrets backends, I don't think you can use two at the same time. But yeah, so your hybrid approach can only really use one alternative and then the other core backend methods, so environment variables or Metastore database. But you can't use two alternative secrets backends currently with one Airflow deployment.
Gotcha. Yeah, that could be an interesting feature request, though. I'm curious to know how many people want to be able to use two with a single instance of Airflow.
Yeah.
Another question on the same note is, can you talk about the best practices you want to think about when you're using that backend secret connection, that alternate secret backend, especially as it relates to all the API calls that have to be made?
Yeah, so if you're using an alternate secrets backend, so for the API calls, really the API, the Airflow API it really works with the Metastore database if you're adding and removing connections or exporting them. If you're using Vault, for example, then you need to use the Vault API to manage and maintain those secrets and those connections. So is that the question? I want to make sure I answer it correctly.
Yep. I think going over the example you said before, where you had a lot of API calls going to Vault for one thing, but not the other, I think that would be really helpful if you were to say again.
Yeah. So so with the Vault backend, what you can do is configure it to look at Vault specifically, and then not look at Vault for other things. So if you configure it that way, you can manage it. So you would set your connections path as whatever your Airflow connections path would be in Vault, and then you set your variables path to null and your configuration path to null. So then it won't look there, and then it'll look at the other secrets backends in that order. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, totally. So I guess the best practice would be to only make those external calls when you absolutely need them. Right?
Yeah.
If you're not using variables, tell it not to look there for variables.
Yeah. Yeah, you pretty much want to tell it to do exactly what you expect it to do. Yeah.
The last question that I see here is, what's the pricing look like for some of these back-end secrets management tools? Is it easy to get started with them?
Yeah, in terms of pricing, I can't tell you, but in terms of getting started with them, they're really easy. Vault has a Helm chart that's really easy to deploy and get just to play around with. Is kind of what I did with this. It really takes just a few minutes to configure. In terms of AWS and GCP, they have them. It really takes minutes to set up and to get up and running. And there's really good documentation in Airflow on how to configure the backends and as well as what your connection information should look like when stored there. So I would say, it's not complicated at all. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, see here. Yeah, another question that's related to your direct experience is, as someone who's contributed to some of the Airflow backends that you need to change, how would you describe your process in getting started with contributing? And do you have any advice for others on how they could start contributing?
Yeah, sure. So what I did was at my previous company, we needed to change the alternate secrets backend to not hit vault so often. So we did that internally, and then I played around with the code, and then we thought it was a really good feature. So I'll be honest, I was really nervous about doing my first PR, and I'm not, I don't think of myself as that great of a developer, and we have some really awesome developers on Airflow open source, so I didn't want my code to look like really bad. So, but you just kind of go for it. And what I can tell you is our Airflow PMC members, they're amazing. I just told them, hey guys, this is my first time doing a PR. You may have to hold my hand, just guide me, bear with me, and honest and open mindset. I can tell you that the Airflow dev community is really receptive. And there's nothing to really worry about in terms of issues with that. Just reach out, submit your PR, and then just have the conversation on GitHub. And trust me, it'll be a pretty smooth process, and they're very receptive. There's no real nothing to be concerned about at all.
It's always tough to get over that initial hump, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Another question is, do GCP connections take access tokens instead of JSON keys for Airflow 2?
So can you say that again?
Yep. So if you're using Airflow 2 to connect to GCP resources, can you use access tokens instead of JSON keys?
So I don't know specifically. I've only used JSON keys. So I don't want to say what you can't do. I don't know if they allow for access tokens for those resources specifically. Unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you on that.
But if you're using the workload identity, I think that uses access tokens under the hood, even if the hooks themselves aren't directly using them.
Absolutely, yeah.
Next question would be, yeah, this is a tough one here. How do you secure the people from pulling secure credentials from the CLI, as well as from potentially the Airflow.cfg file?
So the CFG file, I think it's really on who has access to that CFG file. You can probably secure that. I'll be honest, I'm not a security expert. Mine is more about the Airflow environment in of itself. But I'll be honest. If somebody wants to print the connection information through their logs or something like that, it's possible they can potentially do that, right? So that's really up to your trust level and your development patterns and your environment with the team, right? The storage of those secrets are really there's that pattern of, okay, I access this information, but you don't want to log them, right, and print them out. In terms of accessing Airflow directly, you can use the same security patterns you work for anything that you deploy in production or any environment, right? In terms of who can actually log in to the environment that Airflow is actually running on and who can manipulate that and change that. Those protections have to be there ahead of time and kind of underlying that deployment.
Yeah,
that's
almost independent of Airflow a little bit.
Absolutely.
I do think that there's some ways in different hooks and operators that you can change that. Yep. Kind of control what gets logged out, what doesn't get logged out. That's something else to take into account. Plenty of good questions filing in, Faisal, so I'm just going to keep throwing them at you.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah. Is there a way to upload connections and variables to the metadata database using CI/CD?
Yeah, I mean, well, CI/CD can pretty much do anything you really needed to be honest. So if you build it in to use the API, for example, then yeah, you can do that. If you have a file like environment variables and you use that and integrate with your Airflow deployment through CI/CD, you can do it that way as well. So yeah, there's many ways you could do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the cool part with Airflow too is that because the API is a first-class citizen, I've seen a few users leverage that API for their CI flows so that your connections get updated automatically.
Yeah.
Follow-up to the questions about sensitive information in Airflow CFG. Do you have to use the Airflow CFG for that sensitive information, or is it kind of optional based on what you're looking to do?
So what sensitive information specifically?
Like if I wanted to use a connect to Vault or store a secret itself inside of there, do I have to keep any sensitive information in that Airflow CFG file?
No, so you don't. So the way I had done it in my example was I had a Docker file that pulled in the certain information from environment variables. So when we share the code and you take a look at it, you'll notice that my Vault token was a user token that I was using for this example. And actually, one thing I had talked about the team was that I didn't actually show, and maybe we'll jump back to it if we have time. But is basically the Vault token was stored as an environment variable. So you can deploy that sensitive information as an environment variable within Airflow, and you don't have to store in a file. And then you can you can kind of just call that environment variable directly instead of writing them, plain texting them in your Airflow CFG. And what I actually wanted to show that I didn't, I kind of overlooked that was, when you're deploying locally, that configuration that I showed in About Vault with the Airflow backend configs, that's really good to use your user token. That's probably the best way to do it. But when you're in production, you want to use an app role. And maybe when we put out the code, I'll show that as an alternative as well of how to properly connect to Vault.
Yeah, it's a good point. We'll definitely add that to the follow-up.
Yeah.
Question here on ECS. Do you know if there's a doc somewhere out there that shows you how to use IAM auth as an auth method for Vault if you're running on ECS? So I think what Darren wants to do is connect to that Vault backend using the IAM auth.
So I don't know if that's possible. I actually spend more of my time in GCP rather than AWS. So I don't know if that's possible. What I do know is that, yeah, I don't know if you can specifically authenticate with Vault in of itself with IAM roles. What you can do is authenticate with IAM roles of AWS to AWS specific resources. But I don't know if that extends all the way into systems you deployed on them, which I probably don't, but I don't want to say you can't without having proper knowledge.
Yeah, that's a really cool use case, though. We should see if there's a way we can help support that. Last question I see here is using the secrets backend on Azure. So Faisal, do you think it'd be possible in the follow-up just add an extra example on how to refer to secrets in Azure Key Vault? So users on Azure can also take advantage of the examples that you've shown?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can do that. Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. So I think those are all the questions that I've seen so far. I'll give it a second to see if anybody else has more. Going once. Going twice. Awesome. Well, if you do run into any other questions, always feel free to shoot us a note. We're happy to work with you and figure out ways that we can be helpful. Faisal, thanks a ton for the content. I really enjoyed it. And thanks everyone for your time today. We love talking to you about these topics, and be on the lookout for the next webinar, which we'll have information on in our follow-up to this one. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.